right. Hi, everybody. So I'm really happy to have the chance to dive into something today that's really near and dear to me as a product designer. And I actually think like the talk just previous to mine is like the perfect lead-in, because just do that. You'll be fine. So what I want to talk about today is sort of the bundle of things that's encompassed by the phrase cross-platform UX. And hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll walk away with a few more tools in your holster that you can use to be more considerate and thoughtful in your approach when you're working across multiple platforms. So as mentioned, I am the design director at Wealthsimple. Hi, I recognize a couple faces here. For the rest of you, that's my job. And for those of you who don't know Wealthsimple, it is Canada's largest and fastest growing quote-unquote robo-advisor. I don't know why that's what that kind of company is called, but that's what it's come to be called. What it basically is a service to make investing simple, as you might guess. You know, just a few clicks, a few minutes, and you can set up your own RRSP or TFSA or what have you. And I might be a little biased, but I do think it's a really great way to invest and get started with investing. So basically what we're trying to do there from a product perspective is make the complicated and very acronym-heavy world of investment very straightforward, and also very relevantly how to surface that in a consumer-facing product across many platforms. So I'd like to talk specifically about that aspect of being in the product design business today. That is, how can we present the complicated functionality of the products that we're designing and building, and present that functionality on an increasingly complex and differentiated number of platforms, screens, formats, and so on and so forth. And I think hopefully this talk can act as a bit of a cautionary tale for you as well, but also an admission, you know, whatever level we're at in our day-to-day jobs or in our careers, we're all still figuring this stuff out. You know, none of us are going to be 100% experts about how to build something all the time. We're always learning, and that's great. So you have probably heard the saying, the best way to learn is by doing. I'd like to counter that with this. It's possible that the best way to learn is doing something really terribly wrong and having to rethink how you're approaching the problem, possibly to the extent of blowing up a lot of work and basically starting over, possibly from scratch. And that's not such a good soundbite, I'll admit. And not that doing it wrong is really any fun either. I mean, nobody wants to make mistakes or waste time in their design process, but I would argue that it is very, very instructive. And by making these kind of subtle mistakes, and they are subtle, it's surprisingly easy to do this, as I'm about to demonstrate, you will inherently understand how your initial approach, whatever it might be, maybe doesn't actually fit the platform that you're trying to build for. So I think there's a lot of really good questions and discussions out there already around this topic. If you do a bit of research, you know, you'll turn up some that you really fully expect, like should we stick to each platform's guidelines, or should we try to make the apps consistent and look in functionality across the platforms that we're targeting? And maybe this is also kind of like the question, should brand cues sometimes trump the functionality of the platform itself? So if you're Facebook, for example, you might opt to do a very Facebook-y kind of thing over an iOS-y kind of thing or an Android-y kind of thing. And that's not always bad. But what I want to really dig into is something a little deeper than that, like the ways that allow us to build really good cross-platform experiences when we're thinking deeper than just the obvious. So, you know, caveats. Right off the bat, I think we're certainly far along enough in this industry that a lot of this is really super obvious. Of course, web and mobile aren't the same. One is click-driven, one is tap-driven, or touch-driven. One has an absolute ton of screen real estate, and the other has, very limited or constrained screen size to consider. And none of this is surprising. These are the platform conventions that we have to work with, and of course we need to take them into account. But that's really, I think, the surface level kind of table stakes stuff, and it's possible to be very, very mindful of these conventions and input methods and still go into the weeds when we're thinking about the consistency of functionality. So what I want to talk about goes a little deeper than that. I think we need to think deeply about platform intent when we're thinking about cross-platform products. So, and what I mean by that is basically what do these things want to be like? How are we solving a customer need that actually very much fits and feels true to the platform that we're targeting? And not just because they're tap instead of click or small instead of big, but literally because the demands of the UI and of the user and the user's demands in return are in reality very different across all of these platforms that we work with. So I tweeted this a couple days ago after finishing most of this talk, and I think, to my mind, telling a story about how something came together is a really super powerful way to share knowledge about where the rubber actually meets the road, rather than just more in an abstract sense. And so today I intend to do more storytelling and hopefully less story yelling. And I want to specifically illustrate that by talking about two projects that I was personally involved in, both of which included expanding functionality from a single or sort of largely monolithic platform into multiple different forms. And so hopefully by learning from my mishaps and injuries along the way, you'll be a little more forewarned and forearmed in the future if you have to extend web to mobile, or mobile to web, or mobile to VR even, or whatever new stuff we have to deal with in the future as product designers or UX people. So every platform, as I have painfully learned, and you're about to learn, really needs an extra step back, I think, a consideration of factors larger than the very tangible ones that we all immediately think of. Because at the end of the day, when you are building a product, the goal is not to follow the guidelines, however good they might be for that platform, but to build a really great experience for our customers or clients. So I want to start talking about my first cross-platform UX project with this question. How many of you are yoga enthusiasts? That's awesome. That's like way more than I was expecting. So this project actually predates my time with Wealthsimple. This is when I was a hired gun, basically last fall, freelancing. So not too long ago. And I should point out, I think these lessons are not something that really goes out of date. We should be doing this kind of thinking whenever we're tackling a product design project. So anyway, if you are a yoga enthusiast, awesome. You may know about this platform called yogaglo. And the whole point of yogaglo is that you can do yoga whenever, wherever. It's more or less basically like the Netflix of yoga. So I want you all to remember that phrase, Netflix of yoga. We'll be coming back to that in a second. So I'm really actually selling them short with that description. It is a very cool, thoughtful product, and I'm really happy that I had the opportunity to work with them. Not just because I do think it's a cool product, although I don't do yoga myself, but because it was also like a really, really good opportunity to get some hands-on experience with having to tear apart functionality in an existing product and re-implement it for a new platform. So to set the stage, when I started working with them, they basically had two avenues to get at their content. Obviously a web app and a mobile app as well. And those are both, really good, competent apps. And so that's awesome. Like, we're starting from a position of strength here. This should be super easy. Basically all the thinking, all the hard work around thinking about the UX of this product has been done. Nice. And to further set the stage, this was approximately a month or so after the most recent Apple keynote. Maybe not even a month, a few weeks. And to be even more specific, at that keynote, Tim Cook just introduced an entirely new Apple TV. And more or less introduced the idea that basically TV is now a platform for apps. If you're the Netflix of yoga, you can imagine that you're basically like, uh-oh, this is a tailor-made platform to deliver your content. It literally could not be a better fit. So if you're yogaglo, you better get a move on. Taking all that accumulated know-how from web and mobile and getting a TV app to market post-haste. The interesting thing about this was that at that point, nobody really had a good idea of what an Apple TV app was supposed to be like. And the interesting wrinkle on top of that uncertainty, is that they also introduced a completely new input method at that time. So this is the remote for the new Apple TV. So if you're doing anything on the Apple TV, you have to navigate that app with this little tiny touch-enabled slippery soap bar of a remote. And nobody actually had the dev kits for this thing yet. So basically it was kind of the Wild West of delivering an app on a new platform. So how do we get from, let's say, mobile to TV? The very obvious approach, and the one that we took, was basically to map out the views and screens within the existing mobile app, and then try to fit those into how it all might work on a TV. And so here is actually some whiteboard work that we did really early on, teasing apart all the mobile flows and thinking at admittedly a very high level how those flows might work, when they're up on the big screen. And honestly, this is not a terrible approach. In fact, this is probably how I'd approach this now even. But what we didn't really know is how the limitations of the platform would affect how all of this stuff actually got implemented when we got right down to it. So I literally just said limitations of the platform right off the bat, limitations. And I think that's a really good signifier that we weren't thinking about this properly at all. And I think this is part of the trap that it's really super easy to fall into when we're thinking about cross-platform UX. Thinking like, well, it's kind of like a really big iPad that you can't touch, instead of, oh, it's like a TV with apps on it. We're looking for the familiar that we can latch onto as a point of departure for what we're building. So when we started, I think this is basically how we were thinking about the new Apple TV. Like a screen is a screen, right? We're used to screens. We know how this works. And the touchable, swipeable surface is like the touchable, swipeable surface of a phone. We all know this. Put them together, boom, we're off to the races. That makes sense, I think. And it fits our mental model. Cool, let's work with that assumption. And I should point out that having just launched, there weren't really a lot of comparable apps that we could look at for guidance, which also meant there were no obvious red flags going up at this point. Even Apple's documentation around best practices for TV UX at the time were, for the most part, fairly well written. But there was sort of a lot of stuff where they just were like, well, they didn't really even at that time, having just launched this new platform, really know 100% how it was all going to shake out, how people were actually going to build for this and use this. And in a way, we kind of had to build it and find out what worked. And obviously, this is in no way ideal. So we started out with a lot of very low fidelity wireframing steps to try and map this thing out. And we got quite a lot of this mapping done without ever seeing this thing on a real TV. We still didn't have the hardware dev kit when we moved to high fidelity designs. And we started implementing them in the real app that we were building. Orders were super backed up at Apple. Basically, nobody had a dev kit, and we just had to go completely via the emulator. So there was a lot of testing on basically pretend TVs, just our computer monitors, and the power of our imaginations. Like, on a real TV, this will be great. So, in terms of visuals, cool, no problem. The yogaglo brand is really well established. We're following all the same aesthetic cues. Everything's hanging together pretty well. This is looking great. So we're basically nearly done, right? So we forged ahead, designing these interactions and trying to pull like a lot of stuff over that was working really well in the iOS app, some stuff that was working from the web app. And that was kind of our guiding principle for this new platform. If something worked well on one of those other platforms, it should work well here, right? Of course. That makes sense. If we think about how we actually were mentally modeling this platform, TV plus remote equals phone, cool. So of course, we can just pretty much use the same kind of interactions. Which worked right up until we started using this on a real TV with the real hardware. So I think this was really our first big learning during the course of this project, and the first big signal that something was really wrong. And I think this illustrates that you really need to try this stuff on the real hardware. Nothing will tell you that you goofed up faster by actually seeing it on the device that it's supposed to be on. So finally we saw it on a real TV, and it was just brutal in terms of actually using it and navigating it. There was just so much going on, just overwhelming amounts of yoga information. So what we clearly didn't do is speak to and design for the strengths of the medium. Specifically, the strengths, not the limitations. Nobody ever sits down to watch a movie on Netflix and goes, man, I wish this was more complicated. It's just too easy to watch something. So we ended up stripping out quite a lot and more or less taking it back to the studs, basically. And I think a great example of this is actually one of the behaviors we pulled over from web rather than mobile. In some cases, if you hovered over a card that represented a yoga class, you'd get this really nice slide-up panel that provided more information on the class in question. That's great. We're all really familiar with this kind of interaction. It's a really nice way to provide some in-context information, and it seemed like it would work well here, too. So cool, we can do that on the TV. Basically the same way, if a card on the TV has focus, we'll just pop up that info. That's a great use of the real estate. Nope. When we actually saw the app on the real system, up on the wall, a big TV, it seemed very frenetic and overwhelming. And so on a TV, what we learned was that it's really just a lot of, flicking back and forth and popping between the different levels of an app really, really quickly. So remember Netflix of yoga? Netflix actually really has this problem on lock. If anybody knows about cross-platform, it's Netflix. And I think the interesting lesson here is that we didn't really take that time to stop and think and look at what Netflix had actually done right in terms of their cross-platform UX. I think we were just thinking, how can we show yogaglo on a TV? Whereas the question we should have asked is, how does a TV want to show yogaglo? So what we did is just move our knowledge and UX expectations straight from the web and iOS, right into TV land without respecting that it was really totally its own thing, even though it seemed very familiar. So TV, obviously, just like mobile and web, has its own conventions and intent that we needed to take into consideration. So I'll touch on that specifically more in a bit. So that was one big learning. Everything is its own thing. And I want to talk about a different, but in many ways similar project in which I clearly failed to learn the lessons of the past, and again started with the very best of intentions. So if you use Wealthsimple, and if you do, you rock, you may have noticed that fairly recently we redesigned basically the entire app. And the response to this was really hugely positive, surprisingly so. Our clients were really happy with it. There was basically no negative feedback. It was amazing. So hooray, good job, everybody. So following up on that, clearly the next priority, really like a fast follow, if you will, since we know what we're doing here, obviously, is to redesign the mobile apps. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. So a huge part of the redesign was bringing together a lot of information and statistics and functionality around your investments that just literally wasn't possible before. This was basically a from the ground up rethink of how to present your Wealthsimple account. And we talked with a lot of clients, we did a lot of concepts and prototypes, and one of our core principles from the get-go was that mobile should not be a second-class citizen. In fact, we emphasized that our goal was total feature parity. Everything that you can do on the web, you should be able to do on the mobile, or on mobile. And in many ways, this is very admirable, I'd like to think. And then unfortunately, we fell into basically the same trap. So this one was a little more insidious. It's not like we didn't know what we were setting out to do, or that this was even an entirely new platform for Wealthsimple. It wasn't. But more to the point, I think having just come off this really, really successful redesign of the web product, we just basically kind of had the notion that we knew what we were doing. We could take the ideas of functionality from the web and use it more or less wholesale on mobile. Accounting for the obvious platform differences, but that aside, a lot of the patterns are the same, the flow pretty much the same, the design language is certainly the same. We should be good to go, right? We were very, very confident that we had this on lock. So confident that we basically got mobile development started before we had really 100% worked out the designs for the native UI. The fundamentals are there, obviously. Let's just get going. And again, I think we came back to this. We didn't account for the intent of the platform. So I want to look at some pretty early wireframes for the mobile app, or the web app and the mobile app together. Obviously web on the left, mobile on the right. Those seem really suspiciously samey. And again, this isn't necessarily bad. This is just, early thinking and talking about platform consistency and feature parity, all the stuff that we really wanted to do. And if that's our goal, of course we're going to look at it like this, like a one-to-one mapping. And we know what the sections and functionality have to be. Let's map it out for desktop and then map it out for mobile. Easy peasy. And in this case, that lens that we were using of total feature parity, of equality between all the platforms that we knew we had to build for, led us down a bit of a garden path, in that we were thinking very, very much about features and implementations and consistency, and not enough about what the very real native to platform version of those features looks like. Our notions of consistency and parity got in the way of doing what was true and what was right for mobile. I actually want to step back from Wealthsimple specifically for a second and look at something that actually informed a lot of our thinking, which is Twitter taking a very, very similar approach with regards to their own platform parity. They were all about using the same components and same basic experience on all iOS devices, for example. And on the surface, again, this seems correct until you see this. Twitter, I think, like us, didn't consider where their patterns were going to come apart due to the very real needs and wants of the platform itself. And so an iPhone SE and an iPad Pro, or even just an iPhone and an iPad mini, for all that they share an operating system and a lot of the same interaction features as a physical device, are not really the same platform from a UX perspective. So it turns out we went through a ton of design iterations trying to figure out why this thing wasn't hanging together. And the fundamentals of the app from now, or from then until what we actually launched, haven't really significantly changed all that much. But what we did to solve our design and interaction problems was respect the platform. You know, the aesthetic is the same, the information that we're surfacing is pretty much the same, but the functionality and the way that you interact with that functionality is not the same, and it can't be. It literally cannot be the same. And I think it's tempting to think this way, that it can be the same due to stuff like responsive web, you know, where we're kind of just taking a lot of the same web stuff and making a condensed version of it, roughly. And this is a really subtle, insidious problem. You know, mobile web and native mobile, although they seem like they should be the same, are not the same thing. And in this case, much like the TV example, there was just too much stuff. We were really overloading the mobile experience, or the user experience of mobile. And this amount of stuff we were trying to shoehorn in there, you know, it felt really roomy and breathable and great on the web, but it felt super claustrophobic and unmanageable on mobile. So as you can see, as we move from left to right, we're really simplifying and just cutting stuff out. And this isn't a screen size issue. This isn't even a bad design issue per se. This is a mismatch of intent to platform. And I'll talk more about that realization in a second. So I really, really love this example. This is the same screen, about 5 design iterations apart from each other. So we started on the left with something that's like, dang, you just put a website right in your app. Like, come on. And we ended up with something on the right that felt much more truly native and much more true to the platform. And to be fair, everything that's on the left is still accessible within the app. None of that information was lost. You know, the app certainly is informed by desktop web. It's speaking the same brand language, so it still feels like Wealthsimple, and it is driving all of the same outcomes. We're not, you know, trying to do one thing on web and one thing on mobile, but it's much, much more respectful of the mobile platform. So what I'm getting at is that feature parity isn't actually a bad goal. In fact, it's a pretty good goal, and we're building back towards that. But more so, our takeaway from this was that each platform really does speak its own language of interaction. And if you've done your job right, all the platforms that you're working with will seem, you know, more similar and tied together than they really are. And it's easy to forget, obviously, that they are in fact very different and want to be used differently. So I think our job as potential cross-platform designers is to make those different wants and needs make sense in context. So how do we actually figure out how to solve these problems? How do we get to launch, both with the mobile app and with the TV app? What were the good approaches that we actually uncovered that allowed us to actually get there and get it out the door and feel good about how it came together. And if we're not strictly thinking about platform capabilities, or not entirely, or, you know, what are the other things beyond that, how should we be approaching this problem? So I really love making metaphors about design because it's usually such an abstract topic. And I think tying it back to concrete stuff really helps us to draw inferences that help us think about this. And I also like food. So in this case, that's web on the left. Let's say it's a very healthy breakfast. And mobile on the right is a small chocolate bar. And I guess TV, if I had to extend this metaphor, is maybe a bowl of popcorn. And in all cases in this metaphor, you're eating. In all cases, you're having an experience around dining and food. But the modality and the interaction of all of these experiences, the intent is very different. You're not going to approach that meal the same as that chocolate bar. And I've been talking almost exclusively about the outcomes of these learnings. So I want to dive into sort of the whys and hows and how we came to think about this. So all along, I've been talking about something that I've been calling platform intent. Well, what is that? You know, as we went along, we really tried to slice this up in a few different ways and try different models that would help us make sense of this and just make better stuff. And, you know, diagnose why they were or weren't working. But I think at a very, very high level, we can pare it down into sort of 3 buckets or gauges of user behavior to carve up a good cross-platform experience. So in this case, my model for platform intent is time, scope, and action. And if we look at the 3 types of platforms that I talked about, we can see how those buckets might apply. Web, for instance, is usually sort of moderate time. People might spend a solid 10 minutes to complete a task. They're taking actions to complete a flow, however complex that flow might be. But they're probably doing a few other things at the same time. So we need to account for the fact that they are multitasking or distracted. You know, it might be something they need to come back to, and we need to support that intent across web. Mobile, on the other hand, tends to be much more about small, single tasks with very, very hard time boxes around them. You know, you need to get in, you need to get out, you need to complete the thing. And this was, you know, a really good learning for us. How can we translate what was actually a flow task into a quick hit task? And this is something that somebody really wants to complete in one sitting. This can be a really, really huge jump from desktop to mobile. And then TV is obviously not a hybrid of those other things. It has its own usage intent and patterns. Excuse me. It's a huge, pretty unregulated time sink if we're looking at it that way. Nobody wants to complete any kind of tasks. Their action is to explore and consume, basically. So we need to build with that in mind. And those are the parameters that I really didn't respect and that I now have a much more greater appreciation for. And I think it's also what makes cross-platform UX so particularly interesting and satisfying as part of the job that we do is thinking about how to take those interactions and translate that functionality and idea and communication across all of those behaviors and intents. You know, and also to think about not just the 3 that I outlined here, but how those might apply across other platforms, you know, tablets, wearables, VR, and so on. So I really continue to learn to respect the platforms I'm building for, and hopefully make really interesting new mistakes in the future. Thanks. So I really, really blazed through that as well. So definitely we have time for a few questions. I think, to be honest, unfortunately, it's only once we got to high fidelity designs for the mobile app that we realized that there was just a lot of stuff happening. Like we were definitely under a time crunch, which doesn't help. But to all of the team working on this, like the wireframes made sense. You know, no problem. We can show all this stuff. A user can go through this, no problem. And it's only once we saw, like, here is the actual tangible thing. We didn't have an app built, but we were like looking at it on the actual devices. It felt, oh, I'm sorry. The question was, how do we know when we were going down the wrong path with the mobile app for Wealthsimple? So to jump back into that, I think, you know, one of the ways that we could have known sooner, and in retrospect, what would have been a good idea, was to put even lower fidelity mocks on the device, rather than trying to jump just from mocks or wireframes that felt good, seemed to make sense, and we just sort of went from there because we were like, okay, cool, the web is doing really well, mobile can just come right on from there. So unfortunately, much later in the process than we should have. Yep.
So when you've kind of gone down a path in the wrong direction, I'm just curious, how do you explain that to a client?
The question was, if you go down a wrong path, how do you explain that to the client? Which is an excellent question. I think the yogaglo example is actually a really good model for this. Luckily, we were working directly with the product team at yogaglo at that point. So they could see what we were seeing. They were involved in the design process from the get-go. And like they thought it would work too. You know, they had a really great lead designer at yogaglo who had worked on the mobile app, who had worked on the web app, and I was working with him to do the tvOS project. And you know, I think the interesting thing about that is that nobody really knew what was right. We sort of were kind of making it up as we went along. I think so. The takeaway there is something that I would really heavily advise for any design project where you're in a client designer situation is try to involve them in as many steps and as many small discrete steps of the project as possible. And I think if you do that, it won't be like a huge shocker to them that it's not as good or not as tight as it could be. They'll realize this from having been involved in the entire process from the kickoff.
How do you guys structure your team? Like, do you have like a pod structure where you have designers, developers together? Or do you separate it out so you have designers working on a project that then gets handed to the developers who then code it? Or is it more flat?
For those of you who didn't hear that, the question was, how do we structure our team, I assume at Wealthsimple, or ever. So this is actually an interesting question as well, because from the time that I started working with Wealthsimple, we've actually changed this twice as we're trying new things and trying to suss out what the best way to build a really good product is. So we started just very strict kind of sprints. Everyone knew what they were doing every 2 weeks, and just, you know, get this done, get this done. It goes from designer to developer within that time frame, and that's just how we build stuff. And then we sort of realized that the projects that really work the best, especially when we're trying to ship you know, new product across web, mobile, etc., are ones where we just went heads down for as long as it took, and we didn't really care about sprints. We were just go, all the resources, just make this thing happen. But obviously what we've done there is like thrown out a lot of the oversight and sort of planning ability that we had with sprints. So now we're actually converging back towards sort of a model that takes into consideration both of those things, which I think in a way, kind of helps to head off a lot of the stuff that I just talked about, in that no one in that structure is actually isolated. Everyone's in the team from the beginning, and we're doing more kickoff exercises rather than just sprint handoffs or kicking stuff down the chart as we go. The question was, after launching the new Wealthsimple product, I mentioned that we got a lot of really good feedback. And how do we actually go about collecting that feedback? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the time, the answer around testing and feedback is not as well as we'd like. The nice thing is that a lot of our clients told us through email or Twitter or Facebook, like, I love what you've done here. I can finally do X, Y, Z. But there was actually really no coordinated method to solicit feedback from users when we launched or clients when we launched the new product, which I think, to be fair, is something that we should be doing. So this is, again, like, I think the whole sort of testing piece, if we were more invested in that, in user research and so on from the get-go, it would actually really help with a lot of the issues that I identified in this talk, in that we would have far less or far fewer sort of blind alleys or missteps, just because we knew, or we would know up front, like, don't do this, because it's obvious from the users having used this platform that they don't want that thing.
With regards of your Wealthsimple project, when you were doing your research, how much data research you should gather, and how you analyze it, and how much it, and how you analyze it?
I don't know if there's any right answer to that question. The question was, how do we gather research, user research, and analyze the data? In our case, we're very lucky that we work in a product business, which allows us to have a ton of very quantitative data to pull from. So, where users are in like the onboarding flow, or what they've done in the product, and so on. But that alone is not enough to sort of relaunch an entire product. So what we did is actually specifically contact a bunch of our users and say, like, we were sort of redesigning the product. We really want to talk to you and get your insights. And actually, a lot of our users had previously contacted us and said, like, if you're ever changing stuff up, here's the thing I want. Or they just write into support and be like, I really wish I could do this thing. And like, so that's a huge corpus of knowledge that we could draw from, which I think that in any design project, that more quantitative feedback, even sort of on an emotional level and on a wants level, is super important. So I would advise, like, as we just heard, like, you don't need a ton of people, maybe half a dozen, to actually get some good results out of user research. And I've just been informed that's my time, so one more? Okay.
I was just curious, how do you incorporate this, like, self-reflection and learning about your process into your, like, actual process as a team? Do you have a meeting, or do you just check in? Like, how does it work?
Good question. I don't know. This even in putting together this talk, like, I knew, like, oh, we did all these things, but it was bad. This just structuring this information and thinking about what the takeaways were was really, really helpful for me. So now I have something that I can take back to the product design team and say, you know what, we should really be thinking about this, or why don't we try this? And the nice thing about the team that I work with is that it's really open to those kind of suggestions. Nothing is locked in stone, so we can't just say, oh, why don't we try thinking about those 3 buckets? Thanks. Thank you.